Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Deborah, for organizing this. Thank you for contacting me and asking if I'd be willing to speak. It is a great pleasure. I'm very, very thankful to be able here to address all of you. And thank you to each and every one of you for braving the Calgary weather, though today it's not as cold as it otherwise could have been. But it's still icy, it's still wet, and so I do appreciate all of your efforts in coming here, especially finding this location, which, even given the address, it's not always an easy one to find. Just the other day, I called an Uber over, and they ended up in the old age home across the road. I asked them, well, I'm actually kitty corner to the old age home, so then they start driving down the wrong way, down 90th. And I had to run after this Uber cab just to be able to get to a meeting that really ostensibly should have just been a 10-minute drive, but somehow or other it took about half an hour to get where I needed to go. So kudos to all of you for figuring out where we are. Deborah mentioned that I served as the associate rabbi at Kinloss, Finchley United Synagogue. I just have to tell something of a funny story about how I ended up there. So Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, he's the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth, and he was the previous rabbi of this congregation. When he was elevated, when he sort of advanced his career and became the chief rabbi, they had to hire two people to replace him. The senior rabbi was from Australia, and the junior rabbi was Canadian, and that was me. And I was a compromise candidate in several different ways. One way was, and probably the most important way, was that the head of the search committee wanted an American rabbi. American rabbis have a very different demeanor. They have a very different ethos than rabbis in the United Kingdom. And that the head of the search committee was quite keen to get some of that Americanism into a British context. Meanwhile, the actual members of the search committee wanted somebody British. And so the compromise was a Canadian. And that was me. So I was the compromise. I think I was the only Canadian who applied. So therefore, by default, they had no choice. We're going to be talking about Orthodox Judaism. And if I were to ask any knowledgeable member of the Jewish community, what typifies Orthodoxy? What is it that distinguishes Orthodox Judaism from the broader Jewish milieu? They would answer halacha. Halacha is Jewish ritual law and a fastidious adherence to its tenets. Now, obviously there's a spectrum within the Orthodox community as to how devoted one is to every single aspect of Jewish law. And we all fall somewhere within a spectrum, but within Orthodoxy itself as a movement, we recognize that adherence to halacha and a set of theological principles that we're going to discuss eventually, those are what highlight the difference between Orthodox Judaism and the broader Jewish community. Halacha, Jewish ritual law, is the determining factor. And so a huge portion of this class is going to be devoted to explaining the transmission, how halacha or how Jewish ritual law developed, what are its sources, as well as discussing the train of rabbinic authority, the chain of rabbinic authority from its very earliest era through to the common era, to the present era, and we'll finally discuss what exactly halacha is, what exactly are its sources, and we will also discuss the specifics of Orthodox Judaism. So those will be the three parts of the class. One is tracking the chain of rabbinic tradition, talking about what exactly halacha is, and then finally defining orthodoxy with all of that sort of necessary information now firmly implanted in our cognizance. So we have to go back to a very early period of Jewish history, or Jewish rabbinic history. It's probably the very first period of Jewish rabbinic history where the rabbinic leadership begins its start. And it starts with a group of people called the Knesset Hagadola. which was called the Great Assembly. Now, the Great Assembly was an assembly of scribes, sages, and even some prophets, which existed from the early Second Temple era, from about the year 500 of the Common Era, or before the Common Era, rather, until the Hellenistic period, which is about year 330 of the before the Common Era, which is the period when Alexander marches down the Levant and conquers Israel. It roughly coincides with the period of time that the Persians had hegemony, the Persians had control over this territory. The people who formed the Knesset HaGedolah, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, according to rabbinic tradition, included such biblical figures as Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Hananiah, and others that are notable for being personalities, individuals that we read about at the tail end of the biblical period. They're notable for being the promulgators of several developments within Judaism. For example, they fixed the biblical canon. The biblical canon was somewhat amorphous until this point, with some works being considered, some works not being considered, and they brought in specific books and incorporated them into the biblical canon. So much of what, if you were to open up the Old Testament, you would find a set of works. These were determined by the men of the Great Assembly. We'll talk more about that shortly. Also, there are certain rabbinic edicts that were put into place, such as the holiday of Purim, the festival and the Feast of Esther. Many synagogue liturgical rituals were also created by the men of the Great Assembly. So they're very, very important, and they're really considered to be the first step or the first stage of rabbinic Judaism. Now, who exactly were the men of the Great Assembly? Well, we have a certain idea, we have a certain tradition that they form a very important link in the transmission of the Torah, at least as it's conceived of by us. According to a Mishnah, and we'll talk about what a Mishnah is shortly, but according to the Mishnah, which is a snippet of oral teaching that was codified in the 3rd century, there is a train of the chain of transmission that begins with Moses at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. Moses receives the Torah at Mount Sinai. He transmits it to Joshua. Joshua transmits it to the elders. The elders transmit it to the prophets, and the prophets transmit the tradition to the men of the Great Assembly. We even have a paraphrase of this Mishnah in a 10th century commentary that which is considered to be almost a continuation of this snippet of oral teaching that even includes specific prophets as being part of the tradition. So we start off with, again, Moses at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah from God, him giving it to Joshua, Joshua giving it to the elders giving it to the prophets, and then the prophets giving it to Haggai, Zechariah, and Nehemiah, biblical personalities, who they themselves transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly. So the men of the Great Assembly is a body that's composed of, most notably, Ezra, Nehemiah, and specific prophets, and continues a train of practice that continues over the next several hundred years, until about 200, 300 years or so, until the time of Alexander the Great. Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, is referred to in that same teaching as being the last member of the men of the Great Assembly, and it makes a lot of sense that he would be referred as such because, according to rabbinic tradition, it was Simon the Just who met Alexander on the road on his way to conquer Jerusalem. So we have a fairly extensive period. How many people made up the men of the Great Assembly is also something of discussion, and we have disparate traditions. According to the consensus opinion that seems to be the most widespread amongst sages that immediately followed them and subsequent generations, so we're talking until about the year 500 or so of the Common Era, it was assumed that this was a body that was made up of 120 people. What does that mean, 120 people? It can mean any number of things, to be absolutely honest, because if it was only 120 people, that's about several hundred years, and there would never actually form a quorum of people that could actually pass any kind of rules. According to rabbinic practice and rabbinic tradition that was promulgated by the men of the Great Assembly, you have to have a quorum of 70 people in order for there to be a legal decision that is rendered, that's binding on the entirety of the Jewish people. So it probably means that there was a rotating group that continuously formed a group of about 120 people. According to the same sources, and we're talking about the Talmud, and we'll talk more about what the Talmud is shortly, this was a group of 120 people that also incorporated, that also included specific prophets, those prophets that we mentioned earlier. Some historians actually will note the fact that, according to this tradition, that there were 120 members. We actually find references to the number 120 in various sources within the Bible itself. Nehemiah and Ezra, for example, are always described as operating with a quorum of 120. So probably the number 120 was significant in that it came to represent the entirety of the Jewish people with in some form of representation, because we see that this is repeated 3 or 4 times throughout the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I will probably revert into rabbinic jargon, and you'll have to stop me. And if you have any questions, and if I say anything that you don't understand, just raise your hand or just call out. Don't hesitate. Rabbis are a subgroup with a culture of its own, very similar to how doctors will talk to one another, and they sort of they sort of digress into their own language that nobody on the outside can understand. Rabbinics works in much the same manner. So I will probably at some point revert to technical language that the members of my congregation would be familiar with, but not everyone here will necessarily know. So just holler if I say something that sounds too foreign. Now, the period of time when we speak about the men of the Great Assembly is, as we said, the period of time when the Persians had control over this area, over this territory. Often you'll find within rabbinic writings that from subsequent generations, you'll find that Ezra himself, who's considered to be the premier member of this body, is sometimes referred to as promulgating decrees of his own. In other places, in the Talmudic tradition, you'll see that the men of the Great Assembly are promulgating decrees. Probably it doesn't make a difference. Ezra only had legal jurisdiction because he was a member of the Great Assembly. So when we talk about decrees that were put into effect by Ezra, as well as by the men of the Great Assembly, it's probably the same thing. It's probably interchangeably. Despite the fact that within the 2 Talmuds, and we'll talk about what they are later, they're referred to separately, it makes no difference in terms of rabbinic jurisprudence, in terms of how we conduct ourselves. What are some of the things that were sort of accomplished by the men of the Great Assembly? What is ascribed to them? Well, as mentioned earlier, they formalized and they finalized the biblical canon. They included the books of Yechezkel or Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, the book of Esther, as well as finalizing the 12 minor prophets. Before this point, the 12 minor prophets were not quite part of the canon, or at least some of them were and some of them were not. The book of Ezekiel was problematic in that it seems to make some heretical statements, and therefore those had to be smoothed over and clarified in order to be finally included. And the book of Daniel was not written in Hebrew, it was written in Aramaic, and there was some question about that. And Esther is at the very, very end. It's at the tail point of the biblical era. It is probably the last book to be written, or at least it describes a period of time that comes at the very, very end. As a result, the books these books were not formally part of the biblical canon, and other books were probably included in the biblical canon if they were floating around at the time. And the men of the Great Assembly relieved some of them and incorporated others. According to some rabbinic traditions that are recorded in the Talmud, they also introduced a triple classification of the oral law, and we'll talk about what the oral law is shortly. They are responsible for defining the oral tradition as forming three parts. One part being midrash, which is biblical exegesis. The other one being halachos, which are received traditions from Moses and practical application of the commandments that are found in the Torah, as well as agados, which are lore and legends that have moral imperative. So, which is actually quite interesting. That means to say that, according to rabbinic tradition, we like to cast back as far as we can the science of how we define oral tradition back to the very first generation of rabbinic leadership. As mentioned earlier, they incorporated the Feast of Esther, or Purim, and determined which days it would be celebrated. They also instituted the Jewish liturgy. If you were to come to the synagogue on any day, you would find that the backbone of any service is the Amidah, the silent Shmona Esrei that's recited, and then is repeated by the cantor, by the leader. This is a part of every single service. It is repeated numerous times over the course of the day. This was authored by the men of the Great Assembly. Likewise, also, they authored all of the blessings. So when we take a break at some point, you will notice that I might take a glass of water. I will say a blessing before I drink it, and I will say a blessing after I drink it. All of these blessings were authored by the men of the Great Assembly. Likewise, also, they authored Kiddush, which is the sanctification that we recite on the Sabbath and on festivals, on Yom Tovim, as well as at the conclusion of holidays and at the conclusion of the Sabbath, we also recite a Havdalah, which is a prayer of separation, where we designate one time as sacred and the other time as no longer sacred. That was also written by them and was incorporated into Jewish practice at this point. According to Rav Shri Ragon, who is a 10th century authority, and he comes from the period of the Gaonim, and we'll talk about who they are, most of the oral traditions that are incorporated into the Mishnah itself, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll come back and explain what it is later on, they were all part of the transmission that was given over by the men of the Great Assembly to subsequent generations. At some point, there was some debate and some discussion that went on about what exactly the tradition was, and those debates and those discussions were incorporated into the Mishnah itself, but the source, the origin of all that rabbinic lore, the rabbinic rulings, all sort of originate, at least in the modern form, from the men of the Great Assembly. Now, the men of the Great Assembly were followed by the generations of the zugos. Now, a zug is a pair, and this refers to a period of time of about 200 years, from about the year 170 before the Common Era until about the year 30 of the Common Era, the late Second Temple period, where the spiritual leader of the Jewish people was in the hands of 5 successive pairs of religious leaders. The zugos were five pairs of scholars who ruled the Sanhedrin as the Nasi, the president of the Sanhedrin, and the Av Beis Din, the chief justice of the Sanhedrin. Okay, the Sanhedrin is a rabbinic body of 70 judges that during the time of Roman rule, during the time of Greek rule, during the time of the Maccabees, had religious jurisdiction and some legislative jurisdiction over the land of Israel and the Jewish people broadly, even those who lived outside. They were the chief and premier halachic authorities, and they do make an appearance in the New Testament. So if you're familiar with Rabbi Gamliel, for example, he was the head of the Sanhedrin in about the year 30 of the Common Era. He was this child of one of the last of these zugos, who we'll talk about shortly. The Av Beis Din, or the Chief Justice, was an office that existed before this time, but his role was to oversee the Sanhedrin. He didn't have any executive authority of his own. It was during this period that these two individuals, these two people, would hold that kind of executive authority over this rabbinic body that was also a legislative body. Who are the 5 pairs? Well, these are actually an interesting group of people. The first pair, who reigned during the time of the Maccabean revolt, was Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. They're less known, but the next group is actually quite interesting. Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai Arbeli, they lived at the time of John Hyrcanus, who was the second of the Hasmonean kings. And according to rabbinic tradition, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia was actually the teacher of Jesus. So this was Jesus' rabbinic instructor. Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach, who followed they reigned at the time of Alexander Eunaeus. Shemaiah and Avtalion followed them, the time of Hyrcanus II. And then the most important of this group, Hillel and Shammai, reigned at the time of King Herod. Now, these are really important rabbinic personalities. As we're going to see, they set a pattern, they set a trend, and are considered to be the first generation of the subsequent generation of rabbinic leaders, which a group that we refer to as the Tanoim. A Tana is a borrowed word from Aramaic. A Tana is essentially the analog to the Hebrew word Shana, which means the teachers or the ones who repeat. The Tanoim followed the Zugos. They were rabbinic sages who are recorded specifically in the Mishnah. And we'll talk more about who they were. They reigned from the period of from the 30s of the Common Era through to about the year 220 of the Common Era. Now, the period of the Tanoim is generally referred to as the Mishnaic Hebrew, and it's about 200 years or so, depending on where you count, where you start and where you end. And it comes immediately following the Zugos, as we mentioned earlier. Now, the Mishnaic period is itself commonly divided into 5 periods corresponding to generations, and there are about 120 known Tanoim. The Tanoim lived in the areas of Roman-ruled southern Levant, which was the spiritual center of the Jewish people at the time. After the destruction of the temple, they continued on, they trudged forward, they moved under the auspices of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai from Jerusalem, where they occupied the Sanhedrin, and became and reconvened in the city of Yavne. Other places of learning were also established. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai earned a reprieve from Vespasian. He was a rabbinic leader in Jerusalem during the time of the siege. He's able to get out. He approaches Vespasian and tells Vespasian, Herzachain, listen up, guy. If you're going to have a continued rebellion on your hand unless you give an outlet to the Jewish people, a place where they can continue to study, a place they continue to learn. I'm going to go to Yavne. I'm going to reconvene the Sanhedrin. I'm going to establish a place of learning, and I need you to consent. And Vespasian, to his credit, in fact, did. Most of the discussion that we talk about as the beginning of rabbinic debate starts at this period. And the debates that took place during this period of time are recorded in the Mishnah, which was finally redacted in about the year 220. This is where all those oral traditions that, according to rabbinic tradition, starts with Moses and came to full fruition during the days of the men of the Great Assembly, becomes now a matter of discussion, a matter of debate, and now is also finally written down in the form of the Mishnah. Now, the language of the Mishnah itself is interesting. It is Mishnaic Hebrew, which was the language that the Jewish people spoke until about the year 200 of the Common Era. And the language is also referred to as Lashon Chachamim, the language of the sages, because the primary works that were written at this time were not, fiction or nonfiction. They weren't histories. They were rabbinic writings that transcribed the debates and discussions that went on within the rabbinic academies. The Tanoim were always led. There was always a first among equals who was called the Nasi. If you recall, I mentioned during the last of the Zugos, the last of the generations, of the pairs of leaders, was 2 individuals, Shammai and Hillel. Well, Hillel was appointed as the Nasi, which loosely translates as the prince, the president, the leader. And his descendants retained that role for the next 200 years or so. The holder of the office of Nasi had his own special title. He was always called Rabban, which means our teacher. And the first person to hold that name of Rabban was Rabban Gamliel, who we mentioned a moment ago as being somebody who interacted with Jesus when Jesus approached the Sanhedrin, and there was all sorts of accusations of Sadducean sedition and all sorts of things going on. It was a very, very complicated time. But Rabban Gamliel, who was Hillel's son or grandson, depending on whose chronology you use, was the very first person to bear the title of Rabban, and his descendants for the next 150 years or so bore the title. However, because titles themselves was a novel phenomenon, there's a Talmudic quip that says that a person's name is greater than their title, because historically Jews never had titles. Your name was always more important. If you think back to biblical personalities, even within rabbinic writings, they're never referred to as titles. Avraham or Abraham is never referred to with a title. Moses himself, who's the greatest lawgiver, the most important individual within Judaism, is never given a title. If anything, we give titles after their names. Moses is always referred to as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. Avraham is always referred to as Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father. But we never find titles before people's names until this point. And it was something of people were and the rabbis were somewhat ambivalent about it. While the head of the person who was Nasi, who was the main, after the destruction of the temple, he was the main civic leader of the Jewish people. He was the one who would intercede, and speak to the Roman authorities. He always had the title of Rabban. People who were under him, people who were rabbinic authorities, but who were not the Nasi, had the title of Rabbi, which transliterates into English as rabbi. The Mishnaic period is commonly divided into 5 generations. We start off with the generation that operates around the time of the destruction of the temple. This includes Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who we mentioned a moment ago, who moved to the center of Jewish leadership or Jewish scholarship from Jerusalem to Yavne. We have Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who is Rabban Gamliel's son, and Yehuda ben Bava, who ultimately becomes one of the first rabbis that you ever find described as living in Mesopotamia, who then establishes Mesopotamia as a rabbinic center of learning as well. During the second generation, which operates between the time of the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba rebellion, you have Rabban Gamliel II, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, and Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. So if you're a student of the Mishnah, those are names that are significant to you. The third generation operates around the times of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. This includes Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Nisan Habavli, and Lisha bar Avuya, who's also known as Acher, or the heretic. He is the most famous heretic within rabbinic tradition. The fourth generation operates immediately after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. This includes Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who, according to Jewish tradition, wrote the Zohar, and Yehuda bar Eloi, and Rabbi Nehemiah. And the fifth generation concludes with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is the compiler of the Mishnah. We'll talk about what that is. And then there's a transitional generation before the next generation of Jewish leaders who are called the Amoraim. And again, we're talking specifically about rabbinic leadership. Who are the Amoraim? Well, the Amoraim were those who say, or those who speak. And this refers to the Jewish scholars who operated from about the year 220 or so until the 6th century. They were primarily located both in Israel and in Mesopotamia. And their debates and their discussions were largely codified in the Gemara or the Talmud. And we'll talk about what the Mishnah and what the Talmud is shortly. The Amoraim followed the Tanoim in the sequence of Jewish scholarship. The Tanoims were the direct disseminators or transmitters of the uncodified oral traditions, and the Amoraim expounded upon and clarified the oral law after its initial codification in the Mishnah. The activity of the teachers who operated during this time was devoted principally to expounding the Mishnah, which we'll talk about what that is shortly, which was compiled by the Nasi, also the prince or the president, sometimes also referred to as the patriarch, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. which became the authoritative code of the oral law. And we'll talk more about what the oral law is when we start discussing what halacha is. This activity developed in Israel in the rabbinical academies of Tiberia, Tzipori, and Caesarea, and in Mesopotamia in the academies of Naharda, Sura, and Pumbedisa. In these academies, the main object of the lectures was to discuss and interpret what was considered to be very brief and concise expressions of the Mishnah, to investigate its reasoning, its sources, and to reconcile contradictions, and to compare its canons with those of the uncodified snippets of oral teaching that are referred to as brisa, and to apply the decisions that we find within these rabbinic writings as a precedent for new cases or extrapolate from them in order to rule in cases that had not yet figured within the Mishnah itself. The teachers that were engaged in this work took part in very large debates and discussions that spanned centuries and were finally incorporated or embodied as the Gemara or the Talmud. They're not viewed as issuing legal decisions, but rather extrapolating and applying previously given legal decisions. In addition, the ability, according to jurisprudence, subsequent rabbinic leaders cannot directly contradict previous generations unless they have some kind of contemporaneous source with the previous traditions that can perhaps back up their legal opinion. So when you start talking about this era, they had less autonomy and less ability to promulgate many of their own legal opinions because of these rules and legislation that determines how Jewish law is applied. The Israeli Amoraim are distinguished by their simple method of teaching and expounding the Mishnah, while the Babylonians indulged more in dialectical discussions. And this was especially true in the Academy of Pumbedisa. In fact, I was just studying the Talmud this morning, and there was a reference to the sharp ones of Pumbedisa who were able, through their dialectic argumentation, to argue things that are absurd, and the expression that's used is that they could pass an elephant through an eye of the needle, which means to be able to argue something and argue it successfully, something that's patently absurd and obviously wrong. The first of the Babylonian Amoraim was a man by the name of Rav, or Abba Aricha, and he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the redactor and the author of the Mishnah. He had a buddy, a frenemy, whose name was Shmuel. Remember, if you recall, I mentioned that Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba moved to Mesopotamia and established rabbinic traditions there. Well, Shmuel is a scion of that rabbinic tradition, which was in competition with the Israeli tradition. So Rav, who moves to Mesopotamia from Israel, brings with him Israeli rabbinic tradition and now comes in direct conflict with Shmuel, and this became essentially the very beginning of Talmudic debate and discussion in terms of arguing the finer points of Jewish law. The last of the Amoraim is, according to tradition, two individuals, Ravina and Rav Ashi, who operated in after the year 500 in the 6th century. In total, there are 761 Amoraim mentioned by name, and there are two Talmuds, two versions of the Talmud. You have the Israeli Talmud, which represents rabbinic tradition in Israel, and the Babylonian Talmud, which represents the Mesopotamian traditions. There are 365 Amoraim mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud, while 394 are mentioned by name in the Babylonian Talmud. And again, they stretch a period of time from about the year 200 or so until the 6th century. There is, besides for notable personages, and again, the Talmud gets redacted, the Talmud gets written at this time, which is a compilation of all these rabbinic discussions that went on before this time. The Mishnah is a compilation of rabbinic discussions that went on before the period of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Then you have another several centuries of rabbinic debate and discussion of the Mishnah. That gets recorded in the Talmud, but there are parts of the Talmud that are unnamed, which means to say that the Talmud incorporates unnamed opinions. And this is a reference to people who redacted the work that was written by Rav Ashi and Ravina, who smoothed it over, who explained various parts, expanded upon it, and were active. Some of this was done during the time of the Amoraim, but it mostly takes place in subsequent generations, during the period of the Savuroim. Now, the Savora means the ones who reason. This is a term that we use within the rabbinic tradition to refer to the rabbis who lived after the period of the Amoraim, before the ascendancy of the subsequent generation of rabbinic leadership, who were referred to as the Gaonim. They operated for about a century, from about the year 500 or so until probably the time of the Arab conquest of Mesopotamia. Yes, Bela. So we'll talk more about this later, but just as a bit of a sneak peek. The Babylonian Talmud was written about 150 years after the Jerusalem Talmud, and it incorporates the opinions of the Jerusalem Talmud. It doesn't incorporate everything, we'll talk about that, but it does take their more important halachic decisions into consideration. And that's why we view the Babylonian Talmud as more authoritative. And when it comes to determining Jewish law, Jewish ritual, and Jewish practice, the Talmud Bavli, or the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian Talmud, is viewed as a more comprehensive and more authoritative work, primarily because of that it incorporates the Jerusalem Talmud into its writing. So, who are the Savaroyim? Much classical rabbinic literature generally holds that the Babylonian Talmud was redacted into its final form in the 6th century, and that was largely done by the Savaroyim. We even have some references to Savaroyim within the Talmud itself, which means to say that the Talmud was probably written in a very rough state by Rav Ashi and Ravina in about the year 550 or so, but it then goes through a period of smoothing, editing, redacting, and expanding over the next century by the Savaroyim. And so the Savaroyim become very, very important. And that's another reason why the Babylonian Talmud is considered a more authoritative work, is because it's very easy to read as compared to the Jerusalem Talmud, because the Jerusalem Talmud was not subject to that redaction process, where it wasn't expanded, it wasn't explained, and it's very, very terse, it's very, very concise, and it's very, very cryptic, and it's very, very difficult. I mean, I've studied it. It's not an easy task, especially compared to the Babylonian Talmud. And don't get me wrong, the Babylonian Talmud, you have to break your teeth on it. It's very, very difficult, and that's, when we talk about orthodoxy as a whole, most of Orthodox education starts with children at age 10 or so beginning their study of the Talmud. And we'll talk about why that is shortly. But the Talmud is the central pillar of Orthodox Judaism, of Rabbinic Judaism, because it is the source of just about all of religious law as we understand it as Orthodox Jews. Now, the Savaroyim themselves were followed by the Gaonim, the excellencies. These were the chief rabbis, the heads of academies in the Babylonian or the Mesopotamian territory. The two cities of Sura and Pumbedisa had their own very, very large rabbinical academies, and the heads of these rabbinical academies were called Gaonim. It was a title that they had, and they were the premier rabbinic leaders during the early Middle Ages. The Gaonim played a very prominent role and decisive role in the transmission and the teaching of Torah and Halacha. They taught and studied Talmud and were deciders on halachic matters regarding which no judgment had previously been rendered within the Talmud itself. The period of the Gaonim begins in about at the end of the 6th century. So, at the end of the 6th century or so, probably in the about 590 or so, and then concludes in the 11th century. The first Gaon, according to rabbinic tradition, was Mar Bar Mar, who assumed office in the 6th century. And the last Gaon was Chizkiyahu Gaon, who was ultimately killed during the Abbasid Caliphate when some zealots gained ascendancy, and he was tortured to death. So the Gaonim period lasts for about 450 years or so. There were two major Gaonic academies, one in Sura and the other in Pumbedisa. The Sura Academy was originally dominant, but eventually the Pumbedisa one gained ascendancy. The Gaonim officiated as directors of these academies, and they continued the traditional the traditional rabbinic activities that the Amoraim did. However, it was slightly different. The Amoraim discussed and debated and explained the Mishnah. The Gaonim continued that task, except that their focus was on teaching the Talmud and rendering religio-legal decisions based on its dictates. It was a very interesting period of time because the precedent was still being developed at that moment. So Gaonim initially would receive written questions, and they would have to try and analyze and explain what exactly the halacha is, and they would receive these letters from all over the world, and according to how they're described, they would they would convene the yeshiva, they would convene the rabbinical academies, they would have 70 people sit in front of them, the letter would be read out loud, and then it would be open for discussion, and then the Gaon would, as the first among equals, would render a decision, and then they would write down the decision based on the debates, based on the discussion, and then it would ultimately be signed by the Gaon, and this would be referred to as the modern day Sanhedrin in terms of rendering decision. Sometimes, however, the Gaonim would just sort of write a written response. Often, initially, during the beginning of this period, they were very terse. They would quote. Somebody would ask a question. They would give an answer. They would cite a source, and they would perhaps refute any potential objection, and that would be the end of it. But by the end of the Gaonic period, when questions were being asked that were more broad, their responses ended up being whole works unto themselves. So, for example, Rav Amram Gaon in the 9th century writes what's called the Sidur of Rav Amram, which is the very first description of the order of prayer. While the Talmud discusses it, we have nothing comprehensive that's devoted specifically to what you do on every single day, and Rav Amram Gaon writes the very first one. So we've covered the period of the men of the Great Assembly. We've covered the period of the Tanoim. We've covered the period of the Amoraim. And we covered the Gaonim. So let's talk about the works that they wrote, and most specifically, the most important work that is central to just about all of this, and that is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a collection of Jewish oral traditions that is broadly known as being a composite of the oral Torah. And we'll talk about more what the oral Torah is shortly. It was collected in the 3rd century, and it was written primarily in Mishneh Hebrew, as we said earlier. The Mishnah was redacted by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who lived in the city of Tzipori or its environs, and it likely took place in the year 220 or so. After the Mishnah was compiled, it became the subject of centuries of rabbinic commentary, primarily taking place in the Talmudic academies of both Israel and in Mesopotamia. Both of these centers compiled their own rabbinic commentaries to the Mishnah that became the two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Mishnah is arranged by subject matter. It's divided into 6 orders, each one containing tractates or mesechtos. And according to tradition, they were divided into 6 thematic sections by its author, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Each Masechta itself is divided into a parak or a chapter, and each chapter is divided up into paragraphs, which the Hebrew word for is a Mishnah. So a Mishnah comes to refer to the smallest unit of the structure. The Mishnah teaches the oral tradition by example, presenting actual cases that were brought for judgment, and along with the debate and the rationale and the reasoning behind the various authorities. So in this way, the Mishnah attempts to take the 613 commandments that are found in the Torah and apply them to everyday life. Now, this is very, very important. It does not always bring its biblical source. There were many different writings that were constructed during the period of the Mishnah. You have what are called midrashim, which is essentially re-encapsulates the same teachings found in the Mishnah, except that it's structured as a commentary to the Torah itself. And you have the Mishnah, which is the primary, because it's considered to be the primary work, as well as some more historical works that were written all at this time. Before the publication of the Mishnah, Jewish scholarship and judgment was predominantly oral, as according to the Talmud, it was not permitted to write down oral teachings. However, during the period of time, during the time of the destruction of the temple, with the destruction of the temple, during the first Roman-Jewish war, Jewish legal norms were in upheaval, and in order for rabbinic discourse to be preserved, justification was found for it to be written down. And it began being written down at this point, and finally compiled, redacted, smoothed over by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in about the year 220. He went as far back as he could. He supplemented when necessary. He clarified, and he tried to resolve contradictions. But by and large, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's voice himself is silent, except by virtue of the fact that often unnamed opinions tend to be his own opinion as well. Now, what exactly is the oral Torah? This becomes very, very important within Orthodox Judaism. The oral Torah was, according to rabbinic tradition, was given to Moshe at Har Sinai as an exposition of the Torah itself. So you have to remember that the Torah is rather terse in its language. The Torah, for example, says, offer sacrifice X, but it doesn't necessarily describe how the sacrifice, the specifics of the sacrifice. Or tefillin, phylacteries, they're supposed to be worn, but it doesn't tell you what they are. So the oral traditions are these explanations of what the Torah, what the Bible means when it says what it says. And according to rabbinic tradition, these were sort of part and parcel of what was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, as well as accumulated oral traditions that from the sages onwards sort of added to the oral law. And this became the bedrock, this became the fundamental structure of halacha. The Mishnah was redacted and then became the source of study, which ultimately became the Talmud. The Talmud is the central text of rabbinic Judaism, and within rabbinic Judaism, within Orthodox Judaism, it is second in authority only to the Torah, only to the Bible itself. It's the primary source of Jewish law, or halacha, as well as Jewish theology. It records the teachings, the opinions, and disagreements of thousands of rabbis and Torah scholars who are collectively referred to as Chazal, which is an acronym, Chachamenu, our sages of blessed memory, on a variety of subjects, on Jewish ethics, philosophy, customs, history, folklore, amongst other topics. The Talmud is the centerpiece of Jewish culture in nearly all communities and is fundamental to Jewish thought and aspirations, and also serves as a guide for daily life. It's made up, again, of commentary to the Mishnah. It doesn't cover all of the Mishnah, but it covers some of the most important more important tractates. There are two editions, there are two versions that reflect two different rabbinic traditions. You have the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was a written codification of oral traditions that had been circulating for centuries, and was ultimately written down in about in the 4th or 5th century or so. It is viewed as being rather incomplete. The Babylonian Talmud consists of documents compiled over a later period of time that incorporates the previous Jerusalem Talmud, and it was authored within the Babylonian centers of study, primarily the places such as Pumbedisa and Sura. The Babylonian Talmud is the culmination of centuries of analysis, dialectic, and explanation of the Mishnah and the Talmud. There is a lot of discussion as to when the Talmud was finally authored, and when you compare the two Talmuds, as we mentioned earlier, the Jerusalem Talmud is much more fragmentary because it did not experience the same period of redaction as opposed to the Babylonian one, which is quite lengthy, and it's about 2.5 million words. We'll stop for just a moment. I'm just going to read a quote from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz wrote as follows, and then we'll continue from this point after a short break. And this is what he wrote, and this basically does come to highlight the importance that the Talmud has within Orthodox Judaism. If the Bible is considered to be the cornerstone of Judaism, then the Talmud is its central pillar. No other work has had a comparable influence on the theory and practice of Jewish life. The Talmud is a repository of thousands of years of Jewish wisdom and the oral law, which is as ancient and significant as the written law. All of this finds expression therein. It is a conglomerate of law, legend, and philosophy, a blend of unique logic and shrewd pragmatism, of history and science, anecdote and humor. Although its main objective is to interpret and comment on a book of law, the Mishnah, it is simultaneously a work of art that goes beyond legislation and its practical application. Though based on the principles of tradition and transmission of authority from generation to generation, it is unparalleled in its eagerness to question and re-examine convention and accepted views and to root out underlying causes. The Talmudic method of discussion and demonstration tries to approximate mathematical precision, but without having recourse to mathematical or logical symbols. The Talmud is the embodiment of the great concept of Talmud Torah Lishma, which is a mitzvah and a positive duty to continue one's religious study, to acquire learning and wisdom, study which is, in the end, its own reward. And we'll conclude here for a brief intermission, and we will continue shortly thereafter. We'll discuss what exactly halacha is. We'll talk about the authorities that compiled the most important works within halacha, and then talk about Orthodox Judaism more specifically. And all of this is necessary information, everything that we've covered, because all of this is core, all of this is central to how Orthodox Judaism views itself. So please, by all means. All right, so let's continue. So one area of Talmudic scholarship that developed, and it came to its fullest form in about the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th century, was developed out of a need to ascertain the halacha, or Jewish rabbinical law, from the Talmud. And so you end up with very early commentators, especially Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who operated in northern Africa in the 11th century, who attempted to extract and determine the binding legal opinions from the entirety of the Talmud. And as I mentioned earlier, the Talmud is 20 volumes this size. The Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi wrote a commentary that takes the specific halachic or the legal rulings that are determined to be authoritative, and you find them in the back of the Talmud right here. This was a very influential work, and it began a series of legal codifications that proliferated. For example, Maimonides, the Rambam, wrote a legal codification of the Talmud that he refers to as the Mishneh Torah. Others did as well. This period of time, when all this was going on, in the period that follows the Gaonim, through to the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll talk about shortly, which takes place in the 16th century, are referred to as the Rishonim, or the earlier authorities. These were the leading rabbis and halachic authorities who lived during this period of time, specifically before the writing of this work over here, the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll talk about that shortly. The rabbis who came after the writing of this work are generally referred to as the Acharonim, the later ones. When it comes to legal jurisprudence, we do operate with the same mindset that I mentioned earlier. And that is that if you're classified as being from Generation B, you cannot directly contradict Generation A unless you have another source from Generation A that can back up your reasoning. But to simply disagree with earlier authorities is counter to Jewish religious jurisprudence. That means that Acharonim, the generations who follow this cohort, who appear in the period of time after the 16th century, have less autonomy to be able to argue with the earlier authorities, again, unless they can bring some kind of legal precedent from the same generation. Now, the Acharonim are the latter ones. They follow the writing of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, it literally means the set table. It's generally conceived to be the premier codification of halacha or Jewish law. The Acharonim is the period of time in which we find ourselves today. The Acharonim are contemporaneous with the early modern period, the foundation of Hasidic Judaism, the emancipation of Jews in Europe, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, Zionism, the Holocaust, the foundation of the State of Israel, and the Jewish exodus from the Muslim world. That is us. Rabbinic leadership, at this point, we refer to ourselves as being Acharonim, later authorities. So why is the Shulchan Aruch so important? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, halachic application or halachic extrapolation from the Talmud was prolific during the period of time between the conclusion of the Talmud until the writing of this code. With the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, and I'll show it to you in just a moment, we really find our premier halachic code that then goes on to be determinant for Jewish religious practice. This is essentially what it looks like. The Shulchan Aruch is in the middle, and the rest are all rabbinic commentary and extrapolation of the law and explanation. And in order for an Orthodox rabbi to gain smicha, we have to be an expert in this corpus, and this is about a 6-volume or so work, and this is what Orthodox rabbis have to study. Besides being familiar and studying the entirety of the Talmud, Orthodox rabbis also have to be experts in the application of Jewish rabbinic law, which requires us to know this very comprehensively.
Can you give an example of that?
Okay, so
Just like coal stones.
an example?
Yes.
Okay, well, I was just looking at the Shulchan Aruch this morning, who talks about the class who counts as whether or not children who are minors can count as far as a quorum is concerned, whether or not a person's cognizance, whether or not a child who knows, for example, who he's praying to, whether that individual can perhaps, under situations of duress, count for a quorum in the case where you don't have 10 adults. There's the Shulchan Aruch essentially says no. Other authorities sort of quibble with this point and apply it under some circumstances and some situations in some ways and not in other ways, and that becomes a major point of discussion. But it
When they say no, do they give a reason?
He's a minor. He doesn't count for a quorum. But the question is, well, whether or not perhaps his cognizance of God makes him just good enough so that you have a quorum for prayer. That's a discussion, and ultimately the Shulchan Aruch decides no. He cannot be counted for a quorum, regardless.
That would be the final decision.
Well, that's the final decision of the Shulchan Aruch. But then you have the questions of application about whether or not this is a conclusive statement and how you apply it. Yes.
Just to bring it to more modern times about the capabilities of minors, there's a thing going on in Sweden right now about if you're criminally responsible, the age is 15. But because of this prevalence of gangs and they're recruiting younger and younger children, they're changing the law there to make you criminally responsible at the age of 13. Is that sort of an example of what would be in Talmud?
No.
You wouldn't have a legal issue. Isn't that kind of a legal issue?
You would have, well, for example, I just had a discussion earlier about what would be in the Talmud. You have an argument within the Talmud. That might be something that's discussed in the Talmud, but that specific discussion there is not in the Talmud. The Talmud takes it conclusively that a child has to be 13 years old, a male, 12 years old for a female, and they have to produce pubic hair in order to be considered an adult, no longer considered a minor. The moment they've achieved both of those points, they're considered to be legally culpable for all decisions that are made and have all the social obligations that adults do, as far as that's taken as a matter of course.
And that is covered. That whole point is covered because it's at
Yeah.
the age, which is very appropriate.
Right. Another discussion was, about the composition of the Bible in terms of whether or not it was given in its entirety to Moses at Mount Sinai, or was it gradually did it come out in drips and drabs and finally recorded at the end of his life, as recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's a discussion that's found in the Mishnah. That's then further expanded upon within the Talmud itself. These are all the discussions that go on there. It basically touches on anything that you can imagine. Now, what exactly is the Shulchan Aruch? Well, the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo in about the year 1563. And it's broadly considered to be the code of Jewish law. It's the most widely consulted of the various legal codes found within Judaism. Together with its commentaries, it's the most widely accepted compilation of halacha or Jewish law that's ever been written because of how comprehensive it is. Now, you might ask me, well, Rabbi, didn't you say a moment ago that Maimonides also wrote one? Yes, I did. And there's a very specific reason why Maimonides' code was not universally accepted, while the Shulchan Aruch was. And this has to do with the geography of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are divided into different segments of the globe with various traditions. Broadly speaking, you open up a siddur, a prayer book, whether you're a Jew from the Middle East, whether you're a Jew from the Spanish diaspora, whether you're a Jew from Yemen, or whether you're a Jew from Poland, the structure of the siddur is, broadly speaking, largely the same. But there are some minor differences and minor changes that reflect local customs. Local custom is very, very important within the application of Jewish law. The Jews of Europe are called Ashkenazim. We have one legal tradition. The Jews of the Spanish diaspora are called Sfaradim. You have Mizrahi Jews who come from Mesopotamia, who are sort of Jews from the Mediterranean who are not descendants of the Spanish diaspora after the expulsion in 1492. And you have Yemenite Jews who are of a completely different extraction. So but the largest two groups are the Ashkenazim, European Jews, and Sfaradim, who are the Jews who are descendants of the Spanish diaspora. Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, himself was a victim of the Spanish expulsion in 1492. He was a child when it happens. He ends up in Greece and then finally lives his adult life in the land of Israel, where he writes first a very scholarly, long, comprehensive work called the Beis Yosef, which was then a Cole's Notes version was produced in the form of the Shulchan Aruch. Why does it gain acceptance by the two largest communities? Well, because Rav Yosef Karo himself was a Sephardi. His writings reflect Sephardi custom, Sephardi practice. But if you were to open up, you'll see that there is a small print within the Shulchan Aruch itself. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but you have a large print and a small print. What exactly is the small print here? Well, this is a work called the Mappa, and it's actually tongue-in-cheek. The Shulchan Aruch is the set table, but the Mappa is the tablecloth. And this was a work written by Ramosha Isserlis. Ramosha Isserlis was a Polish rabbi who was writing himself a codification of Jewish law. He saw that the Shulchan Aruch was already complete and says, why do I have to reproduce this? But, however, this Shulchan Aruch reflects Sephardi opinion. It reflects Spanish practice and custom. So he wrote an addendum that explains Ashkenazi practice, and it's been incorporated into the Shulchan Aruch ever since. This is the addition. This way the Shulchan Aruch you find here is the way it's been written, sans the commentaries, since the second edition of the Shulchan Aruch, which was in the year 1575. Which means from the very beginning, the Shulchan Aruch always incorporated a concession and an accommodation to this other large group of Jews. So once you have the Sephardim accepting this as a legal code, and once you have the Ashkenazim accepting it as a legal code, along with its commentaries that also expand and explain Ashkenazi practice and custom, you find that it broadly, over the course of the next century, gains almost universal acceptance. Why did the Rambam, why did Maimonides not get the same treatment? Well, because he did not have a Ramosha Isserlis to write an addendum that would perhaps accommodate the larger the other large segment of the Jewish population. The Rambam, however, Maimonides, had a stricture. Rabbi Avram ben David of Posquares wrote a stricture that pilloried the Mishnah Torah, and that shook confidence in the rabbinic community that we can rely on this code, in addition to the fact that it did not incorporate or accommodate the other large Jewish population of the day. because the Shulchan Aruch, because the Code of Jewish Law, because the set table was written in this manner, in this way, it went on to garner widespread acceptance. Yes? Well, every work was originally written by hand before computers, and then handed to a publisher for printing.
But it was, you say it was published in
1560. It was written by. It was all four of the original volumes were completed in 1563, and then it was first published in 1565 in Venice.
1565, on a printing press.
Yes, on a printing press.
printing press by that point.
Well, yeah, Gutenberg was like 1480s, correct? Gutenberg was in the 1480s, I believe.
Okay, so it's almost a century before.
Yeah. But it's funny. Gutenberg, the first work that Gutenberg published was a Bible. What was the second thing that he published? It was the Hebrew work, because the largest number of literate people running around Europe at the time were the Jews, because we have to study all this stuff from a very young age. So children have to learn how to read, and the Jewish education has always been sort of very, very core to Jewish identity, because we view ourselves as unable to propagate and expand into subsequent and survive subsequent generations without a competent, learned upcoming generation. So study of the Talmud and study of Halacha starts at a very, very young age. And as a result, in Europe, the largest number of literate people were Jews. So the second thing that the Gutenberg published was actually a rabbinic work. I don't remember what it was, but it was something in Hebrew, and it was something for the Jewish community. So what exactly is halacha? Well, halacha is the collective body of Jewish religious laws that are derived from the written and oral Torah. The written Torah is what was transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, and the oral tradition are those traditions that came along with it that were later expanded, debated, discussed in the Mishnah, and then finally in the Talmud. And then the halacha was sort of extracted from the Talmud in incorporating also local tradition and practice in the Shulchan Aruch and other subsequent codes. Halacha is often translated as Jewish law, though a more literal translation would be to go, or the way to go. In the Jewish diaspora, halacha served many Jewish communities as an enforceable avenue of law, both civil and religious, because there's no differentiation of civil and religious law within halacha. The halacha incorporates also civil law as well. Since the Enlightenment, however, many have come to view halacha as less binding on day-to-day life. However, that's not the Orthodox view of things. We view halacha as ever-present and always obligatory. And even in today's world, there are circumstances where even the broader Jewish world have to come to terms with halacha. In the state of Israel, for example, family law and personal status law are under the authority of rabbinic courts, so they're treated according to halacha. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some minor differences and deviations between Jews of European extraction, Ashkenazi Jews, Jews of the Spanish diaspora, Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews who come from the Middle Eastern world that are not part of the Spanish diaspora, and Yemenite Jews. Rabbinic Judaism divides laws into categories, as I mentioned earlier. We have the oral law and the written law that are considered to be of divine origin. They were revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, and they have a level of obligation that must be observed unless somebody's life is in danger, as well as laws of human origin that include rabbinic decrees and custom, things like the liturgy and holidays like Purim, so on and so forth. The division between the two is always a matter of debate and discussion. What category, what class, and what specific law can be classified as one or the other. There are greater leniencies for rabbinic law over biblical one, but if you were to ask any Orthodox rabbi, they will tell you that you're just as obligated to keep one as you are the other. The boundaries of Jewish law are determined through a halachic process, which is a religious ethical system of legal reasoning that rabbis, or Orthodox rabbis anyways, spend many years training in. Rabbis base their opinions on halacha from source material, such as the Talmud, such as the Rishonim, early authorities, as well as legal codes, responsa material, letters written by rabbis, as well as custom and notable deeds of well-known and famous rabbis. There's also a concept in halacha of dina de malchusa dina, which tells us that the secular civil law has halachic bearing and must be observed as well, as long as those laws do not contradict Judaism. So, for example, we view secular civil law as binding and obligatory within the halachic framework. But if, for example, the civil government were to outlaw circumcision, we would not view ourselves as halachically bound to keep that law. Since the days of the Sanhedrin, there has been no body or authority who's generally regarded as having an all-encompassing or universally recognized legal authority, which makes halacha different than the Anglo-American legal systems that have a Supreme Court that allow for the establishment of precedents. Halachic arguments are effectively, yet unofficially, peer-reviewed. When a posek or a legal decider issues a decision, that interpretation is not considered binding except to the querier, the person who asked the question, or that decider's immediate community. However, depending on the stature or the status of that halachic decider, it might go on to gain widespread acceptance by other rabbis and other Jewish communities. Orthodox Judaism views halacha as divine law that was laid down in the Torah. They view rabbinic laws and rabbinic decrees and customs all combining together to form the corpus of what we call halacha. The rabbis, who made many additions and interpretations to the law, did so only in accordance with a methodology that was viewed as being given to Moses at Mount Sinai, where we were given a sort of a hermeneutical set of rules and method of extrapolation. And this is a very important point in terms of defining orthodoxy, and is that we don't view an extrapolation of a law from a precedent as a change in halacha. We view it as an expansion or an extension, a continuation. So, for example, we will extrapolate from established law to new circumstances and situations that we find ourselves. So, for example, when electricity became a thing, there was no legal precedent in order to understand how to apply it as far as Sabbath observance goes. And so, what did the rabbis do I think the first writings really show up in the late 18th, 19th century. What they would do is extrapolate from the laws of fire and apply it to electricity, and therefore understand and know how to utilize electricity on the Sabbath within that context. Now, if you were to talk to a Reform or conservative rabbi, they would talk, the Orthodox their lives are also different than they were 200 years ago. There have been changes. And yeah, I will concede that there are changes. But as far as our legal jurisprudence is concerned, it's not viewed as a change. It's more viewed as an extension, as part of the same chain and the same process, where we're using the same rules, the same methodologies, and the same sort of hermeneutical practices, and applying it to new situations. We don't view it as a change, rather an expansion. So what exactly is Orthodox Judaism? Orthodox Judaism is a collective term for the traditionalist branches of contemporary Judaism. Theologically, it's chiefly defined by regarding Torah, both the written and oral editions, as literally revealed by God at Mount Sinai and faithfully transmitted ever since, which is why I spent such a great deal of time talking about rabbinic transmission from the men of the Great Assembly down to the Common Era. More than any other theoretical issue, obeying the dietary laws, the laws of family purity, ethical laws, and other laws within halacha is a hallmark of orthodoxy. Practicing members of orthodoxy are very easily distinguishable by their lifestyle. They refrain from doing many routine activities on the Sabbath and the holidays. We consume only kosher food. We pray at least 3 times a day. We study the Torah and study the Torah often. We don head coverings. We wear tzitzis, which are these fringes or tassels that you'll see on that we wear either tucked in or out for all to see, as well as modest clothing for women and so forth. Other key doctrines include belief in a future bodily resurrection of the dead, divine reward and punishment for the righteous and sinners, the election of Israel as a people bound by a covenant with God, and the eventual reign of a Messiah who will restore the temple in Jerusalem and gather the exiled Jews back to Jerusalem, back to Israel. Orthodox Judaism is not a centralized denomination, and relations between its different subgroups is often quite strained. The exact limits of orthodoxy are subject to intense debate. Very roughly, it can be divided into 2 groups or 2 subgroups. You have Haredi Jews, who are the ultra-Orthodox or strictly Orthodox branch, which is much more conservative and reclusive, and the modern Orthodox, which are much more open to outer society and partakes in secular life and culture. Each of these groups form independent communities. Almost uniformly, Orthodox Judaism is exclusionist. We regard Orthodox Judaism as the only legitimate way to practice Judaism, and that is universal within Orthodoxy. While adhering to traditional beliefs, Orthodoxy rose as a result of the breakdown in the autonomous Jewish community that began with the emancipation of German Jews in the 18th century, and was shaped by a conscious struggle against the pressures of secularization, acculturation, and rival alternatives to Orthodoxy. The strictly observant Orthodox are a definite minority among all Jews, but we're also joined by numerous people who are Orthodox by association. As I mentioned earlier, Orthodoxy is a spectrum, and people generally fall somewhere on this spectrum in terms of how diligent they are. They apply halacha to their daily practice. And for that matter, also this congregation, many people are not Sabbath observant, for example, though we are an Orthodox congregation, which means that people will associate and identify as Orthodox not necessarily by their lifestyle or how they observe halacha, but rather by what flavor of Judaism they believe to be legitimate and by their association with those institutions. So you have, so it's a motley crew, and we are a large tent. Orthodoxy perceives itself, as mentioned earlier, as the only authentic continuation of Judaism as it was until emancipation. And its progressive opponents have often shared this view, regarding it as a remnant of the past, which often lends credence to Orthodox claims of being the way Jews were before secularization and acculturation. Thus, the term Orthodox is often used generically to refer to traditional synagogues, traditional rites, and traditional observances. Now, academic research has definitely noted that the formation of Orthodox ideology and organization was influenced by modernity, but this was brought about by a need to defend the very concept of tradition in a world where that was no longer a shared value. When secularization and the dismantlement of community structures uprooted the old order of Jewish life, traditionalist elements united to form groups that had a specific self-understanding. This process began in the 18th century in Europe and was then repeated in the 1970s when the Jews were expelled from the Muslim countries, ultimately making their way to Israel, where again the same phenomenon played out amongst Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewry. Now, Judaism never really formed a credo, and that's still the case. But despite this, there are certain requirements of thought that are required, and the absence of which, we'll call them core beliefs, would be considered blasphemous within Orthodox Judaism. So, for example, Jews adhere to monotheism. We believe in one God. This is a major tenet of Orthodoxy. This was sourced in the Talmud and as well as subsequent Jewish writers. Chiefly, we attribute the attributes of God also incorporate that God is one, God is indivisible. He precedes all creation, which God brought alone into existence. God is eternal, God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, and God is absolutely incorporeal and beyond human reason. We say the Shema Yisrael, for example, which is a creed-like statement that's recited 3 times a day by Jews, where we say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one, the Lord is God." The supremacy of the God of Israel is even applied to non-Jews as well within the halachic system. According to most rabbinic opinions, non-Jews are banned from worshiping other deities. However, they are allowed to associate lower divine beings with their faith in God. A definite doctrine within Orthodox Judaism is the belief that God revealed the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, both the written and oral versions, and that the sages promulgated it faithfully from Sinai to today in an unbroken chain. Orthodoxy also holds that the body of revelation is total and complete. Its interpretation and application under new circumstances that are required of every generation's scholars is an act of inference and elaboration. Orthodox Judaism also believes in a future Messiah, and according to this doctrine, a king will arise from the Davidic lineage. He'll bring with him signs such as the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, peace, universal acceptance of the God of Israel, and he'll embark on a quest to gather all Jews to Israel and will proclaim prophethood and restore the Davidic monarchy. Classical Judaism also incorporates a tradition of belief in the resurrection of the dead, as well as the belief in reward and punishment in the afterlife. A relative thorough observance of halacha is the common demarcation that separates Orthodoxy from other Jewish movements. Orthodox subgroups have a sense of commitment towards the law and perceive it as seriously binding, and to a degree that's not visible outside of Orthodoxy. Halacha, like any jurisprudence, is not a definitive set of rule, but rather an expanding discourse. Its authority is derived from belief in divine revelation, but rabbis interpret and apply it. From ancient to modern times, rabbinic discourse was often involved controversy or machlokas, and sages disagreed over various points of law. The Talmud itself is mainly a record of such disputes. The Orthodox continue to believe that such disagreements flow naturally from the divinity of Jewish law, and it's presumed that as long as people are utilizing the hermeneutical rules, and as long as people's intentions are to locate or to ascertain the truth, then both opinions are considered to be as legally justifiable. The plurality opinion also allows deciders or halachic authorities, rabbis who are tasked with determining legal stances and subjects without precedence, to weigh a range of opinions based on the methods derived from earlier authorities. The most basic form of halachic discourse is in the responsa literature, in which rabbis receive letters with questions, and they write a response that explains and justifies their stance, as well as refute any possible objections. Orthodox Judaism emphasizes practicing rules of kashrut, which are the rules of that restrict our diet, the Sabbath, family purity, and tefillah or prayer. Orthodox Jews can be identified by their dress and lifestyle. Orthodox men and women dress modestly and cover most of their skin. Married women tend to cover their hair with scarves or a tichel. They wear veils, snoods, turbans, hats, or berets, or wigs, all to cover their hair, and this is only done after marriage. Orthodox men wear tzitzis, which are the fringes that we mentioned earlier. We always wear hair coverings, and we tend to grow beards as well. Haredi men wear black suits with black hats that they wear over their kippah or yarmulke, the skull cap, and that tends to be a uniform by which they can be identified. Modern Orthodox Jews may adopt the dress of general society, although they too will wear a kippah, they'll wear the hat, they'll wear the tzitzis, the fringes, and they will dress in a modern fashion as long as they conform to the laws of modesty. Orthodox Jews do not engage in physical contact with members of the opposite gender other than their spouse or immediate family members. Kol Isha is a restriction against hearing the voice of a woman singing other than one's spouse or immediate family members. And this is broadly observed within the Orthodox community. Doorposts of a Jewish home will have a mezuzah, a scroll. You can see them on the door frame of the synagogue when you might have noticed them on your way in. You'll now notice them on your way out. In order to observe properly the laws of kashrut or dietary laws, milk and meat sinks have become increasingly common. Orthodox Judaism lacks a central framework and a common leadership. It's not a denomination in the structural sense, but a spectrum of groups united in affirming matters of belief and practice. Individual rabbis often gained respect across boundaries, particularly recognized halachic deciders who are called poskim, but each community largely elevates its own leaders. So, for example, the Haredi world shares a common identity within its own subgroups or subgroups, but rabbis will be recognized across the spectrum within that grouping. The limits and boundaries of orthodoxy are also controversial. No all-encompassing definition has been found that has garnered widespread acceptance. Moderately conservative subgroups criticize the more liberal ones for their deviations from halacha, while the strict hardliners will view the opposite end as not being orthodox at all. Contentious topics range from the abstract and theoretical, such as the attitude towards the study of Scripture, to the mundane and pressing, such as the rules of modesty. Now, in terms of demographics, Orthodox Judaism only encompasses about 10% of North American Jewish world, a larger percentage in Israel, and an even larger percentage in the United Kingdom, where about 66% of the Jewish community in the UK views itself as Orthodox. Now, the Orthodox also have higher birth rates than the other segments of the population. Haredi communities have some of the highest birth rates in the world, averaging 6 families per household. Also, a nearly non-existent rate of intermarriage with members of other faiths contributes to their growing share of the Jewish population. Among North American Jewish children, the Orthodox share is estimated to be at about 61%. So that means 61% of the current class of Jewish children are of the Orthodox persuasion. We're projected to gain the majority by the year 2058 within North America, based on population patterns, trends, and the very large birth rate that we have within our community. So how do we define the various subsections of Orthodox Judaism? Well, we define the different subsections of Orthodox Judaism based on hashkafa. Now, what is hashkafa? Hashkafa is the Hebrew term for worldview and guiding philosophy, and it's also almost exclusively used within Orthodox Judaism. A hashkafa is a perspective that an Orthodox Jew adopts, which shapes many aspects of their life. Hashkafa thus plays a crucial role in how these individuals will interact with the world around them and will influence the individual beliefs about secularity, gender roles, and modernity. It guides many practical decisions, such as where to send your children to school, which synagogue to attend, and what community to live in. Hashkafa works in conjunction with halacha, which, again, we said was Jewish law. Hashkafa is outlook or worldview. Although there are numerous hashkafos, or worldviews, within Orthodox Judaism, they can be broadly grouped into 2 categories, one being Haredi Judaism and the other being modern Orthodoxy / religious Zionist. They have different approaches and different emphases concerning very specific topics. So what are the modern Orthodox? In the West, and especially in North America, modern Orthodoxy, or it's sometimes referred to as centrist Orthodoxy, is an umbrella term that seeks an observant lifestyle and traditional theology, while at the same time ascribing positive value to engagement, if not synthesis, with the modern world. In the United States, and in Canada as well, the modern Orthodox form a cohesive community influenced by the legacy of such leaders as Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, and is concentrated around the institution of Yeshiva University and other institutions such as the Orthodox Union or the National Council of Young Israel. They affirm a strict observance and obedience to Jewish law, the centrality of Torah study, and the importance of positive engagement with modern culture. Both modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism are hashkafos, where the Torah community interfaces substantially with the secular modern world, each from its own perspective with a great amount of overlap. Though not identical, these share the following practices. Modern Orthodoxy attempts to synthesize the secular modern world with traditional Jewish values and observance of halacha, or Jewish law. Modern Orthodox Jews value secular knowledge and are culturally and educationally and politically as well as practically engaged with society. Religious Zionism combines Zionism and Torah observance and views secular activities such as support of Israel, including military service, as religiously important. Adherents are thus similarly engaged with secular Israeli society and are active in politics. The most recognizable subgroup within Orthodoxy are the Haredim, which literally means the trembling or the fervent. They're also known as the ultra-Orthodox and strictly Orthodox. They are the most traditional group within Orthodoxy. Haredim have minimal engagement with, if not wholesale rejection of the modern world. They avow precedence to religious values and accept a high degree of rabbinic involvement in daily life. Haredi rabbis and communities generally accept one another and afford them greater legitimacy than others. They are organized in political structures such as the Agudas Yisrael of America and in Israel, the United Torah Judaism Party. Other organized groups include the anti-Zionist Central Rabbinical Congress and the Eidah HaCharedis. They are easily discernible, as I mentioned before, by their mode of dress. Obviously, most discernibly by wearing black by men, and extremely religious standards for women. Haredim themselves can be subgrouped themselves into three subcategories. You have Hasidic Jews, which originated in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, where they formed a revival movement. Each Hasidic community is aligned with a hereditary leader known as a Rebbe, who's almost always an ordained rabbi. The Rebbe's authority stems from the mystical belief that their holiness and the holiness of their ancestors was inborn within them from the time of their birth. Each of the hundreds of independent Hasidic groups or courts or dynasties has its own line of Rebbes. Groups range from those that are quite large in size, with thousands of households, to those that are quite small. Courts often possess unique customs, religious emphases, philosophies, and style of dress. Hasidic men, especially on the Sabbath, don very long garments and fur hats, which were once a staple of Eastern European Jews, but are now associated exclusively with them. As of 2016, there were 130,000 counted Hasidic households. Hasidic Judaism emphasizes spirituality and Jewish mysticism as a fundamental of faith. Like other Haredim, this community emphasizes halachic observance and is insulated from the secular world. However, unlike the practices of non-Hasidic Haredim, its practices are influenced by mysticism. So there's a variation in terms of engagement with the secular society within Hasidic groups. Some branches, such as Chabad and Breslov, are actively engaged or involved, while some groups, such as Satmar and Bobov, live in isolated enclaves or even in their own towns. Hasidic practices differ from that of the rest of the Haredi world because they emphasize a relationship with their Rebbe, spiritually directed individual practices, and communal activities that usually involve the Rebbe as well. The second Haredi group are the Yeshivish, or the Litvaks. They are especially associated with great yeshivas, or rabbinical academies, where the study of Torah for its own sake and the admiration for the scholars who headed those schools is enshrined. They become defined by their affiliation to their specific yeshiva, their rabbinical academy. The Litvak sector is largely led by the heads of those yeshivos. A third group of Haredi, the Haredi movement, consists of Sfardim, or the Sephardi Haredim, who live mostly in Israel. They're linked to the Shas party and the legacy of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. They originated in the Middle East, and North Africa. As these individuals were kicked out of their respective countries, they found refuge in Israel, and they attended Ashkenazi yeshivas, and they largely took on the mentality of those institutions. Their identity developed in reaction to the racism they encountered, and in the 1980s, the Shas, which was a political party, was formed under the direction of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef with the aim of reclaiming Sephardi religious legacy in opposition to both the secularism of the society around them and the hegemony of European-descended Haredim. What are the specifics that we would say define these various communities, more specifically between the modern Orthodox and the Haredim? Well, one area of difference will be within the value of secular knowledge. Judaism values secular learning within the non-Jewish community. That's pretty much universal. In fact, there's even a blessing that we make when we encounter a non-Jewish scholar. However, the extent to which a Jew should immerse themselves in secular knowledge is contentious. Some argue that the pursuit of secular knowledge complements and refines the understanding of Jewish religious knowledge, which is the view taken by the modern Orthodox. Others view secular knowledge as a worthwhile endeavor as long as it serves a practical end, such as taking a biology class in order to become a physician. Others vehemently oppose pursuing secular knowledge, believing it's not valuable enough. Some even believe secular knowledge is dangerous because it contains ideas that are antithetical to Torah and can cause people to go astray in their religious life. Because Orthodox Judaism is so entrenched in its tradition, questions of how to incorporate and adapt to modernity in terms of modern culture and thought lies at the center of disagreement between Orthodox groups. Modern Orthodox Jews view their interactions with the world around them and development of society as an integral part of their theology. They don't view modernity as a threat. In fact, often they embrace it. Modern Orthodox Jews are likely to view themselves as citizens of the modern world. Modern Orthodox Jews are modern Orthodox or great Jewish thinkers such as Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik sometimes integrated modern thought into their worldview. Haredi Judaism is generally opposed to the idea of integrating modern ideas and culture into their well-established theological thought. They do not wear modern clothing, while the modern Orthodox Jews find no objection to it, provided that the clothing is modest. The appropriate role for women in Jewish life and society at large varies across the spectrum of hashkafos. Hashkafos that are more ready to incorporate modern thought into Jewish life tend to believe in a greater level of gender equality. However, they will not ignore the halachic framework and will sacrifice adherence to modernity to preserve Jewish tradition for this end, to preserve the halachic standards and practices. Some hashkafos do not address or value gender equality at all. Consequently, distinct gender roles are magnified. Currently also, there's much disagreement about the educational curriculum for women, particularly if the Talmud may be studied by women. With the exception of modern Orthodoxy, the majority of hashkafos do not allow women to study the Talmud, although in most non-Hasidic communities, they do study other texts at a very high level. Since the emergence of the Zionist movement, many questions have arisen about the possibility for an autonomous Jewish state in the Holy Land before the arrival of Mashiach, or the Messiah. This issue is especially complicated because the Jewish homeland is partially governed by secular Jews who are not strictly Orthodox. So therefore you have this interplay and conflict between hashkafa and halacha. These two domains are somewhat blurred. Some oppose Israel in its entirety and reject its legitimacy, while religious Zionists and modern Orthodox Jews view Israel as the first step in the process of redemption with the coming of the Messiah. Certain Hasidic groups, especially the Satmar, believe that an autonomous Jewish state in the Holy Land is forbidden by halacha and label Zionists as heretics. For many within the Orthodox Jewish world, self-identity stems from subscribing to a specific hashkafa. Therefore, hashkafa plays a central role in the social life of observant Jews. Hashkafos create cultures that can be very, very different. In North America, for example, modern Orthodox Jews cluster to form tight-knit communities that have their own synagogues, their own high schools, and community centers. Haredi Jews also tend to live among themselves. Jews of similar hashkafos prefer to live together because they share more in common, a shared sense of values, and therefore the kind of education that will afford their children can be directed and be fine-tuned to the specifics of that community. So Orthodox Judaism, just to wrap up in summation, views a long chain of rabbinic tradition that goes back a very, very, very far and a very long way. We view ourselves as a continuation of that process, a continuation of those practices, of those ideas, and we faithfully adhere to the standards, the practices, the ideas that have been in Jewish observance from time immemorial. Rabbis do not view their halachic innovations as changes to the established order, but rather an expansion or an extrapolation. And we also view ourselves as a community, in a very modern sense, partially out of convenience, that is centered around some shared ideas, concepts of self, religious beliefs, and practices. And despite the fact that Orthodox Jews can be subdivided into various hashkafos, often within Orthodoxy we find ourselves affording ourselves greater legitimacy. And as I mentioned earlier, we are exclusionary. We do view Orthodox Judaism as the only legitimate way to practice Judaism. Sorry. We can't mince words here. But at the same time, we're not exclusionary. We don't necessarily view as non-Orthodox Jews as not Jewish. We just view Orthodox Judaism as the legitimate way to practice Judaism. I'm now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals.